Welcome everyone to How the Auditors View ISO 9001-2015 webinar. What I'd like to do now is introduce the moderator and the presenters. I'd like to start off with Khurshed Kutkey, who's the Director of Certification and Audit Services for SGS. Next is Gary Robinson, who is the Commercial Director of Canada for BSI. And lastly, we have Carmine Liuzzi, who is Vice President and Industry Leader for SAI Global. Finally, you find yourself with me, Michael Hart, who will be the moderator of today's webinar. And I'm the founder of the ISO 9001 Club, which is an 8-month experiential program of professional, start-to-finish implementation guidance at group rates. I just want to put up the new ISO 9001-2015 table of contents, because for those new people coming in that are not yet certified to ISO 9001, they may be a little bit confused when we talk about numbers, Section 4 and Section 5, Section 6, and stuff like that. So I just want to mention that the new ISO 9001-2015 table of contents contains 10 sections. But we're only going to be asking questions really about the sections 4 to 10, which are the sections that actually contain the requirements. The first 3 sections of the standard just have administrative sections. The ISO 9001 version 2015 standard is now in its final draft version, and it's been published that way. So the finalized version of the standard is expected to be published in 2015 sometime. Last I heard it was the end of September. Other people think that it might not be until the end of the year. But sometime during this year, it's going to be published. At that time, I believe that the 2015 version of the standard will be the one that the auditors will use for new organizations that want to go through certification. And so maybe I'll just ask randomly the presenters if they can just confirm that. So Carmine, perhaps I can just ask you that question. Is that the way that your organization sees it, that the new standard, when it comes out, the day it's published, when new organizations want to be certified, then they will be certified to that standard, or do you have a different policy?
Well, first, Michael, thank you for putting this together and giving everybody the opportunity to speak with us. The organization, basically, it's going to decide or determine, where the organization is in their process as far as how far along they are with their implementation and such. So will we still continue to accept 9001, 2008 registrations? For a period of time, we will in fact do that. But with our advice would be, if you haven't started the process, you should then start with the 2015 requirements and work towards coming into conformance with those. Just a piece of information was just announced this morning that 14,001 will be issued on September 15th. So we'll only have a little bit more than a week away.
Michael, it's Gary here. And likewise, thanks for pulling this together. It's great to be here with our peers talking about these questions. Yeah, very much along the lines of supporting that response from Carmine. I think like the 15th for ISO 14001, I think the 22nd of this month is what I'm hearing for ISO 9001 as well. So, this is imminent. It's really good timing to be discussing these issues. And yes, we will support 2008. To answer your question, my question would be just to return that. Does it make sense? So, yeah, as Carmine said, if you're starting fresh, absolutely, you should be looking at the new standard. If you've already done a lot of work, perhaps some sort of investigation of how much more work would be needed to move to the standard, because there are a lot of benefits from moving to this sooner than waiting. And it also avoids this situation where you may have to actually move to 2015 much earlier than you would otherwise. So it's there is a 3-year cycle that we're talking about there, but generally we're encouraging folks to move to it, when it makes sense and sooner.
Very much in agreement, Mike. And again, like I said, thank you very much for putting together a very, very good group of people here to address these questions and review how we're going to address the requirements of the standard for our clients. One of the things that we should keep in mind is existing clients, if there are any on the call, they can transition at any time at their next surveillance audit if they choose to. And all it would mean is there may be a little extra time required to cover the change requirements, and each registrar may have a slightly different approach to that.
Okay, so what it comes down to is, if you haven't started implementing right now, it's probably a good idea to use the 2015 version as a standard of choice. If you're already certified, from the date, I believe, from the date that the new standard is published, you'll have up to 3 years to recertify to the new version. That's the first question. The second question is, organizations may have different motivations for implementing and becoming certified to the ISO 9001 standard. What are the different options they have to determine the scope of their quality management system? So, Khurshed, could you give us an idea about that?
Thanks, Mike. Typically, it's the organization that determines what the scope of certification it is that they want. And the drivers for this are sometimes what the customers are asking for. For example, a company may have several product lines or several business units, but there is a demand in the market from their customers that we are buying your product, but we want that your organization must be certified to give us confidence to purchase the product from you. So that's one of the drivers. And based upon this, the organization may then decide that we will certify at this time only a certain product or a certain set of activities or processes or a department, for example. And as an example, a company might be manufacturing computers, television sets, other electronic items, but the purchaser says, I'm going to buy only a television sets, and I want you to be certified for the manufacture and servicing or maintenance or installation of television equipment. And they will say, I will get that certified at this time. So the scope of the activities to be certified aren't generally the prerogative of the organization for ISO 9001.
I'd like to hold on to that question for just a little bit, because I think personally that this is important. For organizations that are thinking of certifying a location to ISO 9001, well, that makes sense because they're self-contained, and it has a lot to do with the whole location being certified to the same standard, so everybody is following the same rules, and it helps to mold that organization. But when you have a situation where you have a location where only a part of that location is supposed to meet the requirements for a model like ISO 9001, don't you think that that can that's kind of like going halfway there, or perhaps it can even cause difficulties in the culture or divisions amongst departments, and where you have to do this because you're certified to ISO 9001, but I don't because I'm not. Can anybody give any of their thoughts on that?
Typically, we do see some potential issues when only a portion of an organization is certified, and that is to identify how cleanly segregated the activities are. In some organizations, it's not an issue, and in some organizations, there is an opportunity for the other business units to see the efficiencies that the organization has gained, to see the cost benefits the organization has gained, and that often drives the other units to improve their processes as well. So there's both a risk and an opportunity for the organization to benefit.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I think in those instances, you see companies moving into it in pieces. So they'll start with a process or set of processes as part of the organization that actually maybe applies to a certain customer requirement and then expand that out later. Interestingly, in the new standard, 4.1 gives a lot of guidance on this, that whole section, 4.1 and 4.2 and 4.3 on scope. If you look at that, there's two new things here that I think are worth discussing. And one is the context of the organization, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that later. And the other one is interested parties. think Khurshed mentioned earlier, what are the customers thinking of this, but also you've got governments, you've got other interested parties that might have some sort of effect on the company and the system. So those are some requirements that I think really play into this discussion around scope and where you draw that line, especially with the flexibility that we're now being given to look at that.
If I can add to that, Michael, as well, it goes past. Unfortunately, too many organizations look at this as something extra that they have to do, rather than actually something that would benefit them by actually having an organized and disciplined approach to the way they conduct their business. So we need to make this transition, or they need to internalize what are the requirements actually telling me to do, because they really are just based on good business practice. So if every individual was actually thinking, well, this is my company and this is how I would run it, that really all the ISO 9001 requirements are just good business practice. So these are things that they should be internalizing and saying, this is just a good way to run an organization. So there really shouldn't be anything extra that has to happen.
Okay, well, thank you, guys. That kind of clarified your views, and I totally agree. If an organization is really thinking of improving itself, it might be an idea to determine in your scope at least to have an entire location go for certification of the ISO 9001 standard. As we're talking about that sort of thing, scope and what we have to do in order to become certified or in order to follow the standard, in earlier versions, including the one that's current, there was an opportunity to say, well, we have some exclusions, and we don't design or product or service, so therefore we want to be excluded from those parts of the requirements. This time around, with the 2014 version of the standard, they have something that's similar, but this version of the standard asks organizations to declare what requirements are not applicable. They don't talk about exclusions anymore. And so this question is for Carmine. Can you tell me if there's really anything different in this new standard? Because it gives the organizations opportunities to say, listen, this is our scope, and oh, by the way, there are certain requirements within the standard that we can't be held responsible for because we just don't do that. So can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, you're absolutely correct in pointing out that the 2015 version of the standard does not use the term exclusions. 4.3 of the standard basically identifies the conditions which the requirements can be omitted from a management system if they are not, in fact, applicable to the scope. In Annex A, it also talks or gives some guidance to assist organizations in the development of their management systems. And really what it comes down to is the organization has to ensure that all the requirements that are applicable are part of the scope, and they can only claim that they're conforming if all the requirements that they have determined are not applicable do not affect their ability to provide and their responsibilities to provide a product that meets all the customer's requirements. If they are trying to do something other than that or excluding something that would affect that, that's not going to be able to be justified.
Okay, so in the current version of the standard, it allows you to have exclusions in, I believe, in one of the sections.
Section 7, yes.
Yes. Now, in the new standard, is it just one of the sections, or is it in several sections?
It doesn't specify. It doesn't specify as prescriptively as the current version of the standard. So if you are going to include or going to exclude something, a justification is going to have to be provided, and at the same time, again, it cannot have any impact on your ability to provide the promised product and get the appropriate intended output to your customer. Any process or requirement that would impact that has to be part of your management system. So it's given a bit more flexibility to the organization, but they need to be careful as far as what they decide they're going to exclude or not.
So I would say that most probably in the new version of the standard, section number 8 pretty well covers what used to be called section number 7, or is still in the current version of the standard.
Correct.
That's probably the largest place where they would have an opportunity to say we don't need to meet these requirements because we just don't do that. But they should watch if they're going to try to exclude it from anywhere else.
That'd be a fair, yeah, again, the majority of the requirements, the meat of the requirements of what most organizations do will be in the operations clause. You are correct.
Okay.
A nice way to look at that, Michael, is if the process to be excluded has any impact on the product, the customer, or the interested parties that you're deeming as important, you can exclude it. I think with all the sections changing headings, it's been more flexible, but that rule still applies, so it's you have to be very specific.
This next question is for Gary. 4.1 of the, and I'm talking about the new version, 2015 version of the standard, requires that the organization understand the context in which it operates. Now, this is something that's fundamentally different for the new standard. What's your interpretation of this, and do you have any examples of what BSI would look for example, for evidence that the organization complies? And does the scope of the quality management system impact the level of contacts needed to be understood?
That's a big question, Michael, the way that's worded.
Let's start out with just what's your interpretation of what the context
Sure. I mean, for me, and it's pretty exciting to see this make its way more into the boardroom. I think we're a lot of these discussions about context and this strategy development and where we're operating and where the risks are. This is where this happens. So for me, this is certainly an area that's starting to bring quality management discussion fully into there. When we look at understanding the context of the organization, it's upstream, downstream, it's geography, it's sectors you operate in, it's external parties, and there's this discussion of risk. So when we start to look at how we're going to audit this, it's an interesting question. Interviews with leadership, I think, is going to be one where we want to get an understanding of what the context is and how the system's set up. Evidence that objectives, performance measures, and risks are joined up. That's another thing. You're seeing a lot of that language work its way through the standard in all of those separate areas. So, as a starting point, that's certainly something that we'll see, and it's also relates to your question on scope. The context of the organization, the interested parties have now a role to play in where we're scoping. So, for instance, you may have previously looked at just scoping on your location, but you may have some supply chain issues that are fundamental to the delivery of your product or service. So you may want to start looking at that, upstream a little bit more. So it's an interesting, very interesting new addition to the standard.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Any other comments on that? Yes, Khurshed.
I agree with what Gary said, and again, there's so many factors that can affect the organization's ability to run its business effectively. So that's the overall context, and this can be seen both as an opportunity and a potential risk. So the standard talks about in the scope statement the ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer requirements and regulatory requirements. So anything associated with that is something that the organization must consider and take into account when reviewing its context and enhancing customer satisfaction. These components are critical. Now, when we look at things that can help the organization's strategic direction, that's an opportunity. But then there are some factors, internal or external, that can affect its ability to achieve the intended results. Those are the risks that the organization must look into when they are defining the context. And examples of this might mean, for example, external issues such as changing technologies. Have they looked at that? Are they at risk of being left behind if they don't do something significant?
Yeah.
Or financial considerations, their suppliers, competitive pressures, economic conditions, and all of these things are some things the organization should consider and factor into their external and internal contexts.
Okay, so let me ask a question, because it's starting to sound a lot like a strategic planning process.
Exactly.
Which it is intended to be, I guess, yes.
which many organizations have, but many other organizations don't have. So let's say, for example, if an organization practiced a good formal strategic planning process, including an environmental scan, which is the collecting of data from all of the different sections like marketing and sales and operations and technology, and to find out more about which interested parties, and we'll talk about that in just another minute, that they serve, and also the direction that they want to go. Do you think that would go a long way if you came in and saw that they had a strategic planning process? Do you think that would go a long way in meeting that definition of context?
I would think very much so, Michael. And one of the things is, I was in a training course just yesterday covering these same subjects, and the auditors are asking me questions. How will we audit this? And what evidence would we as auditors look for when we're looking at whether they've addressed and defined the context of the organization? And what we're talking about is things like you mentioned, the strategic plan. The company's website might be an area that we could look at, the organization's business plan, their annual reports, any outlooks, market research that they do. So these are things that will give us as auditors evidence that the company is considering all of the external and potentially internal factors like unions and other factors, labor unrest, as their perspectives when defining their overall strategic plan.
You know, Michael, I'd like to just add to that. One of the things that we see in many cases is that organizations may go through a strategic planning activity, but then it's kind of like they do it and then that's the end of it. They don't utilize it. They don't update it as frequently as they need to because the conditions change constantly. So the requirement in the standard is basically asking them to kind of keep their finger on the pulse of this and to make sure that in fact they have some process to keep this information up to date so that they can become a nimble organization and react to situations. And this is not something that generally organizations do very, very well. So everything that we've said so far, I agree with, and that's the piece that I think most organizations need improvement on, which is keeping it current and keeping it up to date. Here, Dr. Deming had a very good and very terse phrase about this, and he says, it's not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory.
So in the end, it looks like having a formal strategic planning process within your organization will go a long way to helping to meet the whole issue, the whole requirement around an organization figuring out its context. But if you do have a strategic planning process, and that's what you're using to say, well, this is what we do, this is how we figure out our context, you better make sure that it's not just a dusty plan that's stuck in a binder and stuck in a shelf in the corner of the leader's office. You better make sure that it's a living process and it's updated and looked at throughout the year or throughout the years that the strategic planning process represents.
Correct. Okay.
So we're not necessarily leading the whole issue about context of the organization yet. Part of this whole context of the organization includes asking or looking for or defining who the organization's interested parties are. And you know, when you think about interested parties, the first thing that comes to my mind is stakeholders. What's your take on who the interested parties are, or how an organization would define them? And I'd like to ask that of Khurshed.
Thanks, Michael. This is a rather delicate subject here when we talk about requirements, needs, and expectations. And typically, when we see it at the highest level of the scope of activities, there is a requirement to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. That's in the scope statement at the very beginning. When I look at the heading of this section 5, it says requirement to understand the needs and expectations of interested parties. Now, the first thing you mentioned is we have to determine who the interested parties are and determine their requirements. Although the section heading is understanding the needs and expectations, when we look at the actual text, it says it only states that the organization shall determine the requirements of these interested parties. It doesn't refer to needs and expectations. But when you look at the definition of requirement, it all comes together. The definition of requirement is need or expectation that is stated, generally implied, or obligatory. So now it ties in very well. And this ties in very well with the scope, therefore. The stated requirement is something that must be met. It's a customer requirement. The obligations, the implied components, are the components that that address enhancing customer satisfaction. It sounds a little complex, but if you see the definition of requirement, it is need or expectation. So it does tie in quite well. They aren't separate items in reality.
So, Khurshed, just getting back to the whole idea of what interested parties are, would you consider them as stakeholders? What we would commonly refer to as stakeholders?
Absolutely, yes. It could be anybody. It could be employees, employers, stakeholders, bankers, financiers, the people who use your product, for example, as well, and unions. So any person that has an interest or is impacted by the products you buy, sell, it could be municipalities. You may be manufacturing a product that uses a lot of packaging, and they could be impacted by that. So legal requirements, all of these factors are stakeholders, all of these components.
Just to add to what Khurshed said there, I think one of the, if people are looking for rules to guide them in this, I think the issue of relevance is also important. There are a lot of stakeholders. We just talked about quite a few: users, buyers, governments, compliance. There's a lot you can look at here, and the key thing is what's relevant to the function of the QMS, to customer satisfaction, and so that's where, when we're auditing, we're looking for, are you picking up the relevant ones, and how are you dealing with the risks that might be in there? So that starts to come together when you start to look at risk, when you start to look at the overall context and the scope. So it's all related.
Okay, wonderful. Carmine, anything to add, or you think it's pretty well been?
Yeah, again, they've got to consider, the organization's got to consider what kind of commitments it's making, again, to any of these interested parties. Could be the community and such, what have they, they said things like, we want to be a good community partner and such, in which case then, if that's relevant to what they're trying to do, then that has to be included. And so they have to gather all that information together and then basically design their management system that satisfies, in this case 9001, those commitments that they've made, but then all the requirements that they place upon themselves in order to run a sustainable business. So, like you mentioned, the employees, they're a stakeholder. They want a safe work environment. They want some measure of job security. They want, some recognition when they do a good job. The owners and the shareholders of the organization, they want transparency in the way the organization operates and profitability. So once we identify these, then we have to make sure our system provides that.
Okay, so that sounds a little bit like answering the question that David had just put in the chat. He asked the question, just how far is an organization expected to go? I mean, you've got the community in which the organization does business. Does the community have to be put up there as a relevant stakeholder?
Well, what commitments does the organization make to the community and say, here's what we are for us as a member of this same community? What are they promising of what you say? What are they projecting out to the organization? Okay,
so I think it's a matter of it's still left up to the organizations to determine which of the interested parties that they come up with are really relevant. I mean, you could go on and on and on. You could list individuals and everything like that, and you don't want to do that. So it's a matter of making sure that who are the, let's call them stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Who are the stakeholders that we really want to focus on?
Well, 14,001 actually has two good phrases in there. One, it says consider, take into consideration. And basically that means I can think about it, you can provide it to me, but I can reject it. Whereas then it also says take account of, in which case that says, okay, you can that can be expressed, but then you can't necessarily disregard it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So there should be a process to determine that is really what the organization needs.
All right. Wonderful. I'd like to switch to a different subject. This one is about documentation. In the previous versions of the ISO 9001 standard, it started out with document this and document that, and over the years, it just, the requirements for documentation became less and less. Until now, there's almost no requirements for documentation. And I've had people come up to me and say, does this mean that documents are no longer required to show as evidence for certification? And I don't think that's the case. So perhaps, and Carmine, I'll come back to you again on this one. Is it life as normal for documentation? Are organizations expected to have procedures and process maps, ways to tell their employees who does what, when, and where?
Well, the answer is yes. It's just the standard, again, as you said, there's been this deliberate intent to move more towards a performance-based management system standard, which is reflected in the 2015 requirements. The focus is more on the effectiveness of the activities and less on the path taken to get there. But organizations still need to have an organized and disciplined way to conduct their operations, to provide stability, and then be able to take the appropriate measurements to tell them whether or not they're performing properly. So in clause 751, it talks about documented information required by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the management system. So it's leaving it up to the organization to decide that. Documented information is important because that kind of preserves the memory of the organization as people move around throughout the organization in different jobs and such. And this is reflected also in clause 716, where we talk about organizational knowledge and preserving that. What the documentation looks like, that's a decision that the organization has to make. And you have to think about the users of the documentation to ensure they can read it, first of all, if we have a diverse workforce and people don't all speak English. But every organization is going to have some level of documents that provide guidance on how the work needs to be done.
Okay. Thank you, Carmine. Gary, I'd like to ask you this, or put you up front on this question, because Carmine talked about the fact that the new standard actually calls documents documented information. They also will refer to records as documented information.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what you would expect to see as evidence in an audit for documented information?
Sure. I mean, 7.5, if you look at it, we're not removing this clause. Whenever we used to talk about records or documented procedures, we're now calling it documented information. And as you read through, you'll probably find about 18 sections where it still refers to the need for that. So this idea of organizational knowledge, it's important to have. I think what we're seeing is the realization, and as we've modernized the standard, we're seeing that it doesn't always have to be a procedure or document. It could be a video, it could be experience and training and exhibiting that through the process. There's a lot of different ways to get to that same result. And as I think about how we're going to be auditing our clients, I think a lot of them will still have their manual, they'll still have their procedures because they've invested a lot in those process maps and what they've put out there. So that's still fine. That still fits within the definition of documented information. In fact, it fits very well. But what it's now allowing is some flexibility in the way that we look for that. So it's not a given you have to have that manual direct procedure. So for us as we're training our auditors, it's to keep an open mind. Are there other ways that you can show that this is happening? It doesn't always have to be that format.
Yeah.
That's going to be fun. I think it's going to be interesting to see how a lot of the newer companies coming first time to ISO are going to interpret and work with this.
Yes. The standard does specify that you need to keep documented information to the extent that you can demonstrate you're meeting the requirements. But in some areas, it's very specific about where you must have documented information. And The standard doesn't, it uses the word documented information both for procedures, as we used to call it, and for records, as we used to call it. And the way to identify it is based upon the context of the usage. So typically, in ISO 9001:2015, when you see the term maintain documented information, they are requiring that you must have a documented procedure, what we used to call. And where they use the word retain documented information, that's where they're expecting to see a record of what has been done and demonstrates conformity to requirements. So there's about 10 places where you have a requirement to maintain documented information, or as we call it, a procedure in the earlier standard. And there's about 20 places where you have a requirement to retain documented information, which means a record. As examples, you are required to retain documented information for design and development inputs, design and development controls, and so on, competency requirements, and so on. So these requirements are still there, although they're couched in different terminology. That's it.
Thank you, Khurshed. While we're on the subject of documentation, I'd like to just kind of follow up with a question for you about the process approach. I mean, the focus on the process approach is not necessarily new, but it seems to be much more of a focus this time around in the new version of the standard. Can you tell me what your perception is as far as the difference between the process approach and traditional procedures, if any?
Yes. The process approach actually came around many years ago. I think it was in the 2000 edition of the standard when it actually moved into the mainstream. And typically what it expects is that when we do an audit, we audit the activity, the process, its inputs, its outputs, and it involves a systematic definition of the management of the activities by the organization. Historically, in the past, in the old 1987 edition and 94 as well, typically what we had seen is people were auditing to requirements of the standard. So I would now audit, for example, the training activity, and then I might look at the purchasing activities, and I might then look at calibration, and I do these in isolation. Whereas in actual reality, what I should be doing is looking at the procurement process and see every activity that relates to the procurement process at that point. So I will look at the competence of the people there. I'll ask them, what competence have you got? And I will follow up later on the training. I'll look at their documentation control procedure. Do they have the procedures they needed, if they needed them? I now look at the adequacy of the procurement process, how they got the design inputs. Typically, procurement requirements sometimes come from the bill of materials of the design output. How that feeds into procurement, how the procurement process now feeds into the receiving inspection when the goods are received by the organization, how that then feeds into the operational control processes, the product realization processes. So I'm going to follow the process of an item. Typically, I'd see, okay, what do you have on the shop floor that's now nearing final inspection and ready to ship? And then I will follow that trail all the way from the time the order came into the company and see how the process was managed effectively all the way through the chain as it moved from customer inquiry through to receiving a clarification of requirements, ordering materials required, procuring materials, tracking of the materials as they came in, incoming inspection, and follow it all the way through. And all the time I'm looking at each activity in the production process. I look at calibration of equipment at the same time. So I don't work in isolation, but I audit multiple components of the standard concurrently.
I'd like to focus on risk right now. The word risk is mentioned in the 2015 version of the standard at least 16 times. Every time that the question is brought up as to whether or not there's a need for a formal risk assessment program within the organization in order to be able to meet the ISO 9001 requirements, I hear back that no, it doesn't have to be a formal program like meeting the ISO standard for risk assessment as well. Just as long as you are performing risk assessment in places where it notes in the standard at a minimum. So I'd like to ask you, Carmine, what your thoughts on this are. What's your interpretation and views?
Well, I agree with your assessment, which is there's no formal requirement, or there's no requirement for a formal risk management process as you would find in ISO 31000. Basically, the organization is required to identify and understand the risk that the business faces on a day-to-day basis, and that's what the intent of Section 4.1 is, context of the organization. So organizations that have done 14 and 18 are probably more familiar with this concept of risk, as it's generally a key component to the development and the assessment of their aspects and impact activities or their hazard assessments. So one thing that we got to mention, or people should recognize, is risk is an implicit, well, it's an explicit requirement at the moment. It was implied in earlier versions of ISO 9001. So as we were talking about a bit earlier, you know, the organizations may do a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities for improvement, and threats as a component of their strategic planning. So the standard's basically asking organizations to take a broader approach to apply risk-based thinking to all of their processes, all their business management processes. The other thing, as we said a bit earlier as well, it's not a one-time activity just to satisfy the standard. It's something that needs to be kept up to date. So the organization has to come back to this and validate their process to make sure that, in fact, they've looked at these things accurately and that the information that they've gathered basically bears out that the level of risk they encountered was correct and such, and the process they used actually evaluated the risk appropriately.
Okay, thank you, Carmine. Any other thoughts from the other two registrars?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I agree. I think this is this whole section being added in is taking over what was the preventative side of preventative action before. It's going upstream with that. I think as we're auditing firms, while we're not looking for a formal risk assessment, certainly that would help if it was there, but you're not required to do that. But what we are looking for is risk-based thinking. We're looking for the evidence of risk-based thinking working its way through the management system. Essentially, this is the preventative side of management. So a couple things to just be aware of there. You know, risks and opportunities have been identified. So we're looking to see some evidence of that, and we're looking to see how actions to address these have been managed. So if you're finding something that's a risk you should be managing, we're looking for some evidence of that. So you can do that without a formal risk assessment process. I think some of the DIS versions had a few ideas in the annex about how you could do that with frequency and likelihood, some simple models. You know, so while we don't need a formal risk assessment, we have seen evidence of this in a lot of quality systems out there. If you've been in aerospace or medical devices, you'll have done a lot of that. Automotive, FMEA, you see a lot of these different methodologies out there. And I think the big difference now also, and Carmine mentioned this, was we're also looking for this not on a product-only point of view. We're looking on this at the context of the organization. So you can have risks to the strategy, risks to the organization, the interested parties. So we're looking for evidence that you've thought about this on a more broader scale as well.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Khurshed, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes, I'd just like to add a few comments. I think we've covered it fairly comprehensively already. The concept of risk, it should be throughout all of the activities. And one of the questions the auditors were asking me is, how are we going to audit this activity? And typically, it's by interview in many cases. So whenever any department that we're auditing, we should be asking the question, what are the things that could go wrong with this process? And what are the things that you could change to make it better? So we're looking at both the risk and the opportunity here. And by asking that question at the very outset about the objectives, for example, are your objectives really valid? Are there other objectives that you might benefit the organization by incorporating? Or are there objectives that are not really helping the organization from a strategic viewpoint? And you can go to purchasing and procurement. If the purchase order is not correct, what is the risk to the organization? If the design is not correct, what if a key person in your organization leaves the organization? And every single stage that we audit, we should be thinking about what are the risks and what are the opportunities as well. So all the way from the procurement to the final delivery stage, will the trucking company deliver it on time? Is there a possibility that the product could be damaged or lost? at the shipping stage. Every component, the packaging and so on, we should be looking at likelihoods of things going wrong and likelihoods and possibilities of improving the processes at each stage.
The one thing to take into consideration is that it's not just risks that they're asking you to look for, they're asking you to look for opportunities. So when somebody identifies something that may go wrong, it may be able to be turned around, or it may be an opportunity that they can take advantage of. And so that's something that's coming up that's going to be kind of different than previous standards. So in Section 9 of the 9001 standard, the new version, it's entitled Performance Evaluation. And this has always been a contentious subject amongst people. So I'd like to just have a short discussion on that, starting with Gary. What are the examples of performance monitoring that the auditor might expect to see?
Okay, this is described fairly well in that section 9. So we're looking for evidence, the determination of what needs to be measured, methods for monitoring. So some things to look for there. Measurement and analysis and evaluation to ensure valid results. That's one sort of block of things to look for. 2, evidence of monitoring and measuring being performed and evaluated. Having done that is something else. I think linking there to objectives and targets here. So we have trace based on performance. That's something that we're sort of looking at. 3, improvement activities defined from the data analysis. So if you're actually have information and you're analyzing it, what are you doing with it? So that's another thing around performance is, are you using that information? Do you have improvement activities that actually flow from that? So there's 3 areas to think about in there. I'm sure there's others we could talk about as well.
Okay, thank you, Gary. So the big thing is, number one, whatever it is that they're monitoring, it's not only collecting the data and putting it up on the board in charts or something like that, but it's actually a continuous improvement cycle. That they collect the data, they analyze it, they take action on it, and they verify the actions. And the other part of it is, many times I've heard organizations look at the whole monitoring part of it, and they say the processes, and they go to their operational processes. Can you give me your thoughts on that?
It's not just the operational, it may include that too. I think, again, we're seeing this pattern of thinking a little more broader about the intent of trying to measure and how we track performance. Again, context of the organization, looking at risks and opportunities there too. We're looking at success of the system, so it's making it broader, it's making it more interesting.
Okay, so it's really they're coming in to look, not only are you monitoring the operational processes that create the product and services to deliver to customers, but also that organizations are selecting management processes to monitor and analyze and everything like that. So they'll be looking for that as well.
Yeah, and a lot of this was implicitly in the standard previously. It's not a brand new area. I think it's just it's defined a little bit better in this version.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gary. The next one is about the audits. There's been a lot of debate about the method of conducting internal audits, with seemingly different approaches being audit by checklist and process style audits. Khurshed, if you wouldn't mind, could you start it off? Can you describe the difference between checklist-styled audits and process-style audits, and whether one is required over the other, or a combination?
Thanks, Mike. Checklists can be very brief, or they can be very, very well developed and very useful tool to have a structured, systematic internal audit. And that's one of the things. A checklist could have, for example, very meaningful questions about each key requirement of the standard and require the internal auditor to add relevant notes about what was seen and whether the process was effective or not. That would be a very good checklist. It can lead to a very structured and systematic audit, and is a great tool for people who do not audit very often. It guides the person to follow a process sometimes. Some checklists may not be as comprehensive, and they may only ask the question, is there a documented procedure, yes or no? is the process process monitoring effectively done? Yes or no? And those are the ones that don't allow adequate depth of the audit to take place. So it comes down to the effectiveness of the tool that's being used to conduct that internal audit, and also the experience of the auditor. Where you have a new audit team, a checklist is a great tool to guide them to do it effectively. Where you have a very experienced auditor, then they may use the checklist to stay on track, but they should be allowed to follow a process and lead and follow a trail when they see that a certain activity indicates they should follow it. For example, they may look at some measuring activity and take a look at the calibration, and they don't see a calibration identification. And they may want to follow that, but they may do that a little later. So an ideal combination would be use a checklist to guide and control the process and allow flexibility to move away from the checklist as well.
Well, I agree with Khurshed. If a checklist is just a series of yes or no questions that basically, you know, somebody goes in to fill it out and the only real goal is to fill out the form to show we've done an audit, that's probably not a valuable tool. The people on the receiving end of that audit are probably going to tolerate an audit and not see very much value to it. We see a lot of these type of checklists with very little information as far as notes about what was looked at in many cases where we know that or we start asking and you find out that the auditors are so busy with their regular work, they just go and this checklist that's been prepared for them kind of lessens their preparation time and the amount of time they have to devote to this, so they just kind of get it done and that's all they do, but they're really, the organization's not getting that comprehensive evaluation of their systems and such that they really need. So the most comprehensive, but every auditor needs some kind of tool. So if we go back to what Khurshed was saying about, you know, something that will guide the auditor through the process and just have things that will keep them, because there's just so much to remember. If it's something that they use to kind of keep them on task and such, and they've done the adequate preparation, then it's a really good tool for an auditor to use to keep them organized and keep them within the scope of the audit and also within the time frame that they've agreed to with whoever they're auditing. You know, the audits are a measurement. The internal audits are a measurement. That's why they're in that section of the standard. And really, it's a source of data for the leadership to understand, here's what's actually going on with what you've put in place. So it's another confirmation in addition to all of those other metrics that Gary was talking about a little bit ago that let us know whether the right things are happening or not. And quite frankly, if we go into an organization and see that their internal audit process is very robust and they put themselves through the ringer, so to speak, we generally don't find a whole lot of findings because they've already found everything and are already working on it. Those are fun audits to do, actually.
I think the tools you use for an audit is also part of the maturity of your auditing organization as well. And I know a lot of our auditors at BSI, we do process-based auditings because you get to some interesting findings through the interconnection of the processes, and it's certainly moving that way. Having said that, we do have tools for checklists when they're needed. You know, one example, you know, for exactly this standard changing, we have a readiness review checklist that we use with our customers to make sure that, you know, we're close and we're getting ready. That's a really good use of when to use one. It provides a lot of insight on the new requirements and what we're looking for. Having said that, that's not all we're doing. So I'm very much an advocate of blending the right tools based on the maturity of your teams and what you're trying to accomplish, and also the maturity of your management system. You know, the first time around, you're very focused on, do I have all the pieces in place? You know, after a full cycle, you're probably focusing more on performance and what else can we do to improve. And
right.
It's changing the nature of how you're auditing. So you really have to flow, and it's probably a good topic for some future webinars on different tools and techniques and when to use them.
Use the same questions every time, which we see happens. The auditors are presented with these checklists. People are pretty smart. They know which questions they're going to be asked, and they know what they're supposed to answer. So really, if that checklist doesn't evolve, it's not really as valuable a tool as it could be.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like it's not necessarily checklist versus process style, but number one, a combination of both is probably more appropriate. Number two, even if you have a checklist, the checklist shouldn't be, do we do this? Yes. Do we do this? No. They should be questions that allow you to think, how do we do this? And to explore it further. And that will give you a much more wholesome audit, a much more in-depth audit. So
Think of the checklist as a tool for you and not your master. You are allowed to ask more than what's on that list.
Exactly. Thank you, Carmine. I would like to end the formal part of this panel off with a last question centering around leadership. I would like to ask Gary to start that one off. The big thing is that now there's actually a section called, in the new version of the standard, called leadership. It seems to be pointing more towards a business excellence model rather than previous versions of the ISO 9001 standard. Can you tell me, has it changed? Has the perception about leadership changed with ISO 9001, or is it just a different name for the same thing? Gary?
Thanks, Michael. I think this is an important topic because it is a change. I think in previous versions we've always talked about, top management involvement would be words you've heard, or executive involvement. But quite often that was a signature on the policy, being in some meetings for management review and being there for pictures taken. And you saw a lot of that activity. I'm not saying it was prevalent, but it's what we're seeing now with this change. I think is we've gone from about 6 to 10 requirements for leadership. And the language is changing. You're hearing and seeing the use of the word engagement a lot more, which is going to be a very interesting area to audit. We're going to be looking for engagement of leadership. And leadership is certainly, your top executive level, but there's other leaders in the business as well. And I think I'll just pull out a couple examples. We talked a little bit about processes earlier, and I thought, promoting the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking. It's not just awareness of these things and knowing about it. It's now promoting the use of these things and being engaged with them. So it's I think I started off today by saying, this context is pulling it into the boardroom. Well, so is this, all these requirements around leadership. There's a lot more in there, and I think this is an area for folks that are already certified to pay attention to, because it's a journey. You're going to have to be exposing this and creating some awareness around these requirements.
Well, I agree with what Gary has said. It's definitely, leadership is at all levels of the organization, not just in the the C-suite or the plant manager or the site manager. The other thing that is very, very critical now, one of the questions you might ask is, and I tend to like to ask this question of people just in general to confirm that what is being told to you by the leadership is actually what's happening in the organization. I ask them about the quality policy, and one of the things I ask is, do you see when the organization makes a business decision that they use this quality policy as kind of their touchstone to ensure that the decision they're about to make is in alignment with what that policy says? And you'd be surprised at some of the answers I get.
Thank you very much, everyone. Unless there's anything else on these questions, that kind of brings us to the end of the formal part of the webinar. But I would like to say to everybody, if you still have questions, stick around, because if you're sticking around, we're going to stick around. I'd like to go to the chat right now that has been going on. There's first a question from David, and I'm not sure if David will need to elaborate a little bit more. But he asked the question, could you define the term normative?
The term normative, when it's used in the context of standards, means it is a requirement. It's not an option. It's as simple as that. So okay. Normative references and appendices may be normative, or they may be for reference only. So there's content in the standard that is mandated as a part of the requirements that the organization must implement. And there are some sections that need not be implemented, and therefore guidance. Okay,
thank you, Khurshed. There's also another question, and this is from Bazinga. And Bazinga asks, will we have a stage 1 audit?
If a company has not been certified, then they will require to have what's called a full initial audit, and that requires a stage 1 audit, which is a readiness evaluation, followed by a stage 2 audit, which is the full audit to verify conformity with all of the requirements of the new standard. If you're a company that's already certified, then you would not normally need a stage 1 audit. You would go into either a surveillance audit or a recertification audit. which do not require stage 1 audits.
Okay, thank you, Khurshed. There really weren't a lot of questions on the chat.
This is one question that gets asked an awful lot, and it's like, do I now have to renumber my entire system to match the new requirements of the standard? And I think we'd like to put that to rest immediately, which is no, you do not have to renumber your entire management system to come into conformance with the numbering system of the new standard, nor do you have to use the definitions or terminology that it uses. You can use your own terminology and such.
Thank you very much, Carmine. That was a pretty important point.
It's funny, when the standards first came out, that was one of the biggest complaints. Wow, the numbers have changed. And one of the things I try and temper that with is, well, the good thing is with NXXL, all of the standards now have the same numbering. So as far as integration, it makes it a lot easier to talk about that now and know where we are.
I'd like to thank everybody that attended. I would like to thank the presenters. Carmine, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you, Michael, for arranging this again.
Oh. Yeah, sorry, Carmine. I forget that there sometimes is a lag between it online. You're very welcome. And Gary, thank you for attending as a presenter.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And Khurshed, again, thank you very much for attending as a presenter. And that's it for how the auditors view ISO 9001-2015. We'll see you next time.